We started this bit with a sentence which I'll just read because it started me off on this search for a theory about representation, is that in terms of representation, traditional forms of interaction do not work for many groups, and alternative spaces have emerged in which representation is staged. We will explore these other spaces and modes of representation, including symbolic creativity, film, theatre, visual arts, and different kinds of digital and material textual practices, and how they may articulate the traditional governance and power. Now, this sentence really made me think and was really valued by the AHRC, because this sentence starts to raise questions about the kinds of representations that we're talking about. Representation in people's minds starts with the idea of voting, possibly, or going to your local council and writing a letter. But for me, as someone trained in English literature and working in the arts and humanities, representation is fundamentally about everyday life, but also fundamentally about different, what I call modes of representation. So when I thought about this question, starting with this idea of other forms of representation from traditional forms like voting, I start with this idea of making your voice heard in different formats, so film, theatre, all those different formats. And for me, the work of Günter Kress is really important, because Günter Kress's work, in particularly his book Before Writing, which is one of my favourite books, actually talks about the connection people have with particular modal choices. Now, a mode is a form of expression. It's kind of materialising your form of expression. So it could be a mode that is visual, drawings, a mode that is gestural. It's stuff that is materialised, and modal choice is something that I think we need to really pay attention to in terms of representation. We need to think about the ways in which meaning-making systems are culturally shaped. So the ways in which young people decide to shape the stuff that they think about shift all the time. Yesterday I was talking to a group of young people who talked about YouTube being where they would put their ideas. Last Monday I talked with a group of young people who said that a puppet show might be the best format for them, given that they wanted to create a forceful argument but without their faces showing. Another group of young people wanted to make a model. Some people feel more comfortable in particular modes, and I think the generation that has just, in the kind of more powerful spaces of society, are very linguistic, and certain forms of schooling privilege a linguistic regime, exam-driven, assessment-driven regimes, and we have to question that. And I think one of the things we need to think about is those are culturally shaped. They're not givens. They need to be seen as something that is contingent on certain kinds of practices. So moving on from Günter Kress, Ruth Finnegan's work in her book Communicating, which I'll just hold up here, really is one of the best books for thinking about representation, because she started her work in Africa, looking particularly in West African contexts of performance and oral speech. And she questioned the way Western linguistics, particularly systemic linguistics from Halliday, constructs arguments on a linguistic platform about the nature of representation, whereas she says actually if you watch people make a performance in the context of staging an argument in a cultural context which is different, you can see the footings from which representations are made are actually different. And again, the naturalistic assumptions that writing is paramount are actually disrupted. So one of the things she thinks about is the genres of particular kinds of representation and the embodied nature of representation, that it's a felt feeling. So one of the things that I really look at is the notion of everyday life as about being represented and about representation. And Paul Willis's work in the ethnographic imagination brings to life the idea of what he calls symbolic creativity, and the idea of social art, that living in daily life is not just about living and doing everyday practice, it's actually about creating structures and artistic thoughts alongside within living structures. And I think one of the things I like about Paul Willis's work is that also the lived awareness of invisible forms. So one of the things we did in Rotherham was look at a book by some girls about the experience of living through the Second World War. And the book itself gave the feeling of what it was like to live through a lot of fear. And it was lived experience that was drawn on from their grandparents, but also it was very much lived experience that they wanted to encapsulate, but in an art form, which is this oral story turned into writing. And I think the art aspect of this is sometimes confused with this idea of kind of high and low aesthetics. And I've tried to break through the aesthetic categorization of these lived representational practices through the work of Terry Eagleton, who really tries to critique the notion of aesthetics as being a field that belongs to high art, the kind of quite sort of elitist forms of art that many people don't actually have that much access to, but rather see art in the everyday, but also see aesthetic practices as shaping and going beyond kind of ideologies and regimes of power, and can actually be quite subversive. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in is the way in which aesthetic categories can kind of be residing within the body, within lived experience, and actually to value the everyday as an aesthetic category. So I'm really interested in this idea of everyday aesthetics and how those can kind of shape people's experiences of representation. And I think Rancière likewise says that aesthetics is shared as the fabric of common experiences. Rancière is very concerned with this idea of invisible worlds, again, that are unseen, and argues that aesthetics moves beyond the sensible and offers a transformative and creative space of action. And he talks about the freedom of the aesthetic, and it's linked to the hope of change. And I think if you're interested in transformation, it's where do you find those forms that create new thoughts for society, new ideas. And I would argue that the state and politics are often very much bound up with kind of existing structures, and sometimes the aesthetic categories and artists can break through that and actually see things differently. And some of the Turner Prize winners have done that, like Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave, but also art can kind of actually disrupt as well the kind of taken for granted, this is how we do it, this is how it is, practices which have imposed upon people certain kind of quite deadening forms of political control. And I think that's why I'm really into aesthetics as a category that kind of frees people up. And also there's something about aesthetics, like watching young people play a song and watching young people dance, and then seeing them move into agency. Through those aesthetic categories, they're providing them with agency. So moving on now to performance, I just talked about dancing, and I think there's a sense in which representation is performed, it's constructed, but it's still very linked to everyday life. So I then looked at the work of Del Hines, who talked about this idea of life as a source of narrative. So he talked about this process by which one often saw a bit of experience becoming an event to be told, being told and retold, until it took shape as a narrative, one that might become a narrative told by others. But he said we need to think about the process in which performance and text live. So we talk about the inner process, the substance, and then the bark, and then you can move in terms of a tree from the kind of inner workings into the final text. And that movement, the grounding and performance and text in a narrative view of life, is really important to think about, because I think if you watch people, because I'm an ethnographer, I watch people think about the things that matter to them. So in Rawmarsh we talked a lot about ghosts, and of course there are the ghosts of the mines, there are the ghosts of people's lives that were lost in the Second World War. There are a lot of ghosts in Rawmarsh, but that then becomes reworked into a ghost story about two twins who lost their lives in the Second World War, and it's the reworking of things that really exist in the community that are quite invisible to outsiders, and that's the kind of heart of the ethnographic project that I'm interested in. And this brings me to Norman Denzin, who's also an ethnographer. Performance in ethnography, which I think is really seeing the aesthetic to foreground cultural meanings, and also to co-create with performers and audience members an act of intervention, a form of resistance. So this is kind of community theatre, but as a kind of ethnographic mode. So it's seeing what's there, but making it into art. So performance becoming public pedagogy when it uses the aesthetic, the performative, to foreground the intersection of politics, institutional sites and embodied experience. So performance is a form of agency, and community theatre does that. So in Rotherham there was a play called Fault Lines, which was about the experience of the Kashmiri communities who came to Rotherham. And I think there's something about the thinking of the construction, I know some of the people who did that, of that performance, which is much about bringing new voices into the field of theatre. And I think one of the things I'm interested in is the moral qualities of aesthetics, and Glinda Hull in particular, who works with digital storytellers in Oakland, California, combines this idea of meaning making in Paul Willis's terms as kind of symbolic creativity with this kind of imaginative vigilance, which is this idea of young people authoring their life worlds using digital stories and other forms of multimedia productions, but kind of addressing issues that really matter to them. So bringing aesthetics into the moral as well as the beautiful, but also this intuitive sense of the meaning-making affordances and aesthetic properties of the mode of the visual image, kind of really recognising that intuition in their productions. So lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Rainn Williams, who kind of is behind a lot of this. Although he was writing in the early 1960s, he really seems to go into the space of thinking about art in terms of the organisation of the everyday. He uses the term the structure of feeling to describe a particular way of life. We talked about these ghosts in Rawmarsh. And he talks about the way in which, in our work, it's partly listening to the experience of people who don't talk the same language, and how this is the actual living sense, the deep community that makes the communication possible that's drawn upon. It's this idea that actually there are misrecognitions and that we aren't listening deeply enough, and that's what my work is trying to do, is kind of listen more deeply. So I think my theory of representation is quite political but also quite aesthetic, and about the shaping of those modal choices, but also about listening to young people's agency within the textual meaning making. And I think for me this inquiry centres on those modal choices that young people make.